to do this because I first met Joe Holloway, our speaker, about 2.5 years ago at his presentation similar to this, and was thrilled at the time, and asked him at that time if he would consider giving a presentation like this to the Smoky Mountain Historical Society. And Joe, from what I understand, seldom turns down an opportunity to talk about railroads, ghost railroads, I believe is what Joe prefers to talk about. And I don't know a lot about Joe, other than the fact that he is South Knox native and works in Knoxville still. And Joe has written a book that he's going to tell you a little bit about as well. It's an interesting book. It's been in the process of being written for about 3 to 33 years, more than 33 years, but hopefully the ink is dry on it. Joe will give you more information about Joe, but I was so enamored by Joe's presentation 2.5 years ago. But for COVID, we probably would have visited with him sooner, and we have enjoyed the advantage of Joe continuing to hone his presentation and program. So that's enough for me. Joe can give you a little bit more of his background. Thank you, Joe, and welcome.
Thank you, Jim. I just first of all wanted to thank you all for having me. This is a body that I've wanted to talk to about the slow and easy Sevierville's Railroad for many, many years. Jim is correct. I've done quite a few presentations over the years. Various types of groups to include the libraries in Sevier County. And so it's a very great pleasure. I've spent a lot of weeks, days, and years up here in Sevier County, and almost feel as if I've kind of got a partial native viewpoint on things about Sevier County, because I've sat in our research halls here in the courthouse, and also over at the old library before it moved to the King family facility. Spent a lot of time over there at the Genealogy Center on the old library side. So Sevierville is a very familiar place to me, and it's great to be here again. As Jim said, I'm a native South Knoxvillian. But I do have one link that's very strong with this city, and that is in this very building is where my marriage license came from in 1989. My wife and I got married not in the courthouse and not at the Temple's Mill, but we got married at a wedding chapel just across the street. But our wedding picture, I wish I'd brought it, I didn't bring it today, but our wedding picture is made on the patio of the front of the courthouse behind the Dolly statue now. So it just so happened that Sevier County Courthouse was the only place that had marriage licenses available on a Saturday. And I was in town because I'd been in the Navy for a few years at that point, and we had a 3-day weekend, President's Day, 1989. We decided to get married in kind of a hurry, not for the usual reason, but because I had orders to Scotland for my next assignment. We had to get things rolling so my wife could be medically cleared to go overseas. So we got it done. That was February the 18th, got married, and we transferred on May the 5th, Cinco de Mayo. So that's, I did much of my life here in Tennessee. Obviously do work for the city of Knoxville, as does my coworker Scott in the back of the room there. Thanks for coming again. You're going to see some pictures you've already seen, but that's okay. I did 22 years in the military, 10 years Navy, 12 years Army, so I was away from home for a while. And I have to tell you that it was tough not to have the research facilities overseas. You know, the internet was almost non-existent, if not non-existent, when we were over in Spain and Scotland. So It was only when I came back home to the States in '96 that I was able to really get going with the heavy-duty research. So with that being said, our topic today is Sevierville's former railroad, and I'll talk to you about its names and history. And let's go back one. First of all, this logo, as you can see by the, it's almost self-explanatory, but the significance of the 110 in this logo is I fashioned this logo not only to celebrate the 110th anniversary of the railroad into Sevierville in January 1910, but also because arguably the most famous locomotive of this railroad was number 110. And many of you natives will remember that at the Gap of the Mountain, which I've mistakenly called Shook's Gap so many times, but I was corrected over the years, Gap of the Mountain, at the Gap of the Mountain, engine 110 sat for about 8 years in the 60s and early 70s, abandoned behind an Esso station there at Shook's Gap, or near Shook's Gap. So we just figured that a logo celebrating the anniversary would be very appropriate if it looked like the number plate on the front of number 110. So that's why it's up there. And I'll talk to you more about 110 here just in a few minutes. Over the years, we have gone from having almost no photographs of the slow and easy line, the Smoky Mountain Railroad as it's most recently remembered. But now we're gathering a whole lot of beautiful color slides and other images. So we've gone from having almost none to well over 400 images in our files. That is myself, my brother, and one other friend that we all kind of team up to do these collections. eBay has become a very great source that people are auctioning this stuff. But this picture is taken out close to what is today Sevierville Golf Course. This is the bridge which comes over Old Knoxville Highway from the creek, which is crossing the creek here. The piers of this bridge still stand, but they're well hidden by vegetation. But this is the only diesel from the Smoky Mountain Railroad, which operated here in Sevierville from roughly 1955 until 1961. And here it is pulling a pulpwood train towards Knoxville. So this is a beautiful color image that we were able to get off of eBay. Again, the piers of this bridge still stand, which incidentally are some of the few structures still remaining on the Smoky Mountain Railroad.
What creek was it crossing there?
I want to say it's Gist, or maybe a branch of Gist Creek, if I remember correctly. That creek kind of winds around through there. This was essentially at the intersection of Reed Schoolhouse Road and Old Knoxville Highway, would be where the photographer was close to standing at this time. And oh, by the way, this picture would have been about 1957 or 58. We didn't have an actual date on it, but based on the painting of the locomotive, we can pretty much date these things. We've narrowed it down based on photo analysis. Here's another picture in the close proximity. My apologies for the overexposure, but this is the way it translates into a projected image. This is, as I mentioned earlier, engine 110, a very famous engine, which was actually built, purpose-built, and custom-built for the Little River Lumber Company and Railroad across the ridge in Blount County. Once Little River closed in about '38, the Smoky Mountain purchased this locomotive, and it was in use for many years on the Smoky Mountain line. Now, the important thing to remember about this particular engine, this is the one that was abandoned at the Gap of the Mountain, and it was in really bad shape, but it is still running today because the Bloom family of Angola, Indiana, purchased it for $3,000, shipped it for $1,800, took it to Indiana and restored it. And it is like a member of their family. It's a pet. So this engine today looks like it's brand new and is still running on a tourist line, actually in southern Michigan. So Coldwater is the name of the city in Michigan. So in any case, this is the 110. There's a problem. If you'll notice, the smoke is going vertical. Now, anybody that knows something about the Smoky Mountain Railroad is that it didn't ever go that fast to begin with, but it stopped because one of the rear truck of that Sinclair tank car is off the track. And Conductor Linebarger is standing in the door of the combination passenger freight car there in the rear, and no doubt using some obscenities, I'm sure. But in the days of the Smoky Mountain, and we'll talk about why, there were many, many derailments. So he's there waiting, and obviously they would have had to send a crew out to re-rail that Sinclair tank car, which was likely empty. This is headed towards Knoxville. And this would have been at the very upper limits of the Sevierville Golf Course, what is today. The abutment of the bridge that the engine is sitting on is still there. You can go and see it if you want to trespass a little bit, but we don't encourage you to do that. So this is one of my favorite Smoky Mountain images. Okay. The Smoky Mountain was the last operating name of the same railroad that operated from downtown Knoxville, well, essentially Vestal, but there was a connection to downtown Knoxville. And these are the various names and the periods under which the railroad operated, this railroad to Sevierville. There are many people today, by the way, that are new to the area. They would never believe it if you told them, hey, there was a railroad here. Because, of course, the signs of it are not that prevalent. You can't see any structures really, or except for now, downtown. We'll talk about Bruce Street here in just a few minutes. But these are the names of the various companies which operated the railroad. More on that in just a moment. The best one I heard was from a lady whose grandmother, I think it was, used to call it, instead of the Knoxville Slow and Easy, it was the kill 'em, skin 'em, and eat 'em. So I had to throw the possum in there for effect. But that was, I had never heard that in all my many years of research on this railroad. And it's been since about 1976 that I've been pursuing this topic. How the railroad started. There was an industrialist in Knoxville who you may have heard of in other history books. His name was William J. Oliver. He was of the Oliver family of Indiana. His was a break-off branch. There was another branch of the family that stayed in Indiana, which produced the Oliver chilled plow. You may have seen at the fair, you might have seen an old antique example of this, but the plow company was not the William J. Oliver branch, it was other members of his family. William J. Oliver had a manufacturing company in Knoxville, which you may know better as Roman Haas today, or Dow actually, Dow Chemicals, I'm sure today is what it is. But if you look at the Dow Chemical Works in downtown Knoxville, you'll see an older brick building. It's very ornate. That was the administration building for the William J. Oliver Manufacturing Company. Oliver had various interests in terms of what projects he was involved in. For example, his company received the original contract to build the Panama Canal. But when it was, I guess, further thought on by the government, the Army Corps of Engineers assumed the role of the primary constructors of the Panama Canal, since it was such a massive project. He, however, his company manufactured things like rail cars for mines and other industrial operations. So even though he did not have the actual contract to build the canal, he built a lot of equipment which was used in its construction. Another thing that Oliver built, if you've ever been next to the Sun Sphere and crossed the Clinch Avenue Viaduct in Knoxville, that was an Oliver project, that beautiful bridge that still stands today. And for those of you who are familiar with railroads such as the old L&N, or what is today the CSX, running down towards Atlanta, if you pass Etowah, and once you're beyond Etowah, the railroad that runs parallel to Highway 411 to Cartersville, Georgia, was an Oliver project. So the KS&E was not the only railroad that he built. The new line of the L&N was constructed under his supervision. So in early 1900s, about 1905, he had a discussion with a personal friend of his who was Samuel Spencer, the president of the Southern Railway. Now, at the time, the Southern was a new venture. It was merged. There were various railroads which merged into the Southern Railway system. For example, the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia, which came through Knoxville, ETV and G, that one became a part of the Southern. Well, Oliver proposed to build a railroad which would connect, bridge across the Blue Ridge, the Smoky Mountains. In one plan, the actual main range of the Smokies, leaving from Gatlinburg. If you can imagine a railroad going over the mountains, think of 441, how it goes today. Well, that would be an incredible engineering feat had that been done. So his plan was to start this in phases and to build the very first portion of it to Sevierville as the first leg of that project. The agreement, the gentleman's agreement, literally, between these two gentlemen, was that Spencer agreed that the Southern would purchase this railroad if Oliver built, the 27 miles to Sevierville, and then either go on to Newport with it or go through Gatlinburg and on over the mountains. That was the ultimate plan. So there was the gentleman's agreement, but unfortunately, Mr. Spencer was killed in this train wreck in Virginia, 06, I believe it was 06. He was wiped out, and with him, the gentleman's agreement. However, being who he was, Mr. Oliver decided to go ahead with the Knoxville, Sevierville, and Eastern project. There had been previous railroad projects that were going to come into Sevier County. One of them was the Carolina, Knoxville, and Northern. During the Carolina, Knoxville, and Northern construction, a major cut was made at Shook's Gap, or the Gap of the Mountain. In other words, the gap there at the county line, as we know it today, was pre-existing gap, but the work, the rock cut and so forth were done to run the Carolina, Knoxville, and Northern project through. That project, as well as the first Knoxville, Sevierville, and Eastern, all failed financially. They did not have anything to do with Oliver. But in choosing the route for the KS&E that we know later, Oliver said, hey, they've made grading and cuts at Shook's Gap, let's use that gap. And that was a major reason why it was routed the way it was. Here in about 1907 or early 1908 is a construction crew. You may have seen this picture in your county archives before. It came from the Sevier County Museum. But this is a construction crew making its way out through what is today the Boyd's Creek highway area, but in those days it was very much open farmland. What you see here is an Oliver manufacturing company, or I should say a Revelo construction, which I'll tell you about that in just a minute. Revelo construction crew building the railroad to Sevierville, headed from Knoxville to Sevierville. One interesting thing about this, there's a young man in the picture, if you can't see it from your seat, I understand. He has a shotgun, and his last name was Johnson. He was 16 years old, and according to the legend or the history behind this photo, he was hired as a bodyguard or as a security guard for the crew building the railroad. He was the best shot in his community. So he had a shotgun and was standing at the ready for any bandits, I guess, that were going to come along and rob the construction crew. That's the only thing I could figure.
Where is he in the photo?
I believe he is standing next to the gentleman with the black suit.
Okay.
To the left. If you see the original, you can see actually part of the gun barrel, but he is up on the car mounted, and actually we have no other names. We have no other names of the other individuals. One other interesting note, something I found out in the process of my presentations. They hired crews every 5 miles. So every 5 miles, there would be a different crew to build this railroad. In other words, they subcontracted or contracted out to the local men. Now, in many cases, I'm told that they repeated groups. In other words, one guy might work from Porterfield Gap Road to wherever, Oak City, and then they would turn around and work another 5 miles later down the road. So this was a way for Oliver, the actual manual back-breaking labor that was required was done mostly by local men with the assistance of Revelo Construction Company. And I mentioned Revelo because that is Oliver spelled backwards. That's Mr. Oliver's name spelled backwards. So his company was named Revelo, as was a little station on down the line. How big of a deal was the coming of the railroad to Sevierville? This cartoon, which looks like the Monopoly man on the right, with an arm made out of railroad track, reaching out to a Sevierville gentleman here with his derby, I guess, would be sort of a derby hat. This was on the front page of the Knoxville paper when the railroad was nearly completed in December of 1909. So it was a big deal. There were front page stories in both Sevier and Knox counties about the completion and the anticipation of this railroad. The coming to Sevierville, the provision of a new type of transportation, the bringing of commerce. It was a very well celebrated in the media, not only by cheerleaders here in Sevier County, because there were editors who wanted this thing built, but just in general, it was believed that this would assist Sevier County, and actually did. This is why any story today, here's personal opinion coming out, any story today that makes accusation that the railroad was inept, that it was late, and I think dreaded, or any sort of negative connotation to this railroad. Obviously, those people did not read all the way back to 1909 and 1910 when it came here, because prior to 1936, when the Chapman Highway was under construction and then completed, that railroad was the fastest way to get to Sevierville from Knoxville. So this was, like I said, this was on the front page of the Knoxville paper just before the railroad opened. These are just some digital maps that were created by a gentleman named Mr. Reeves, and he did a really nice job. There's only a couple of little tidbits that he got a little wrong, but the challenge of anybody that's studying the slow and easy railroad is knowing where the stations were. There's really not a lot of information other than engineering drawings, which Scott back there has been very kind to share with us. This shows you the various stations from Knoxville. The railroad actually started in Vestal, but there was trackage rights that ran to Knoxville, where the World's Fair Park is now. Basically was where the Smoky Mountain or the KS&E station was, there on Cumberland Avenue and Main Avenue, right where the Second Creek Valley of Knoxville. So this shows you how the railroad progressed through South Knox County and into the Gap of the Mountain, or Shook's Gap. Here's the eastern portion of the railroad to Sevierville. And as you can see, today it would have paralleled Boyd's Creek Highway much of its way, and you can still see remnants of it in certain places, especially in the fall when the leaves are off the trees. And then it proceeded down the river valley from Ewing, which I believe was also had the name Henderson or Henderson Springs, if I recall correctly. But it came into the city of Sevierville, and the station, the original station, would have been very much behind today's Ollie's discount store or Tractor Supply. It would have been along the street there that goes behind that shopping center. Speaking of the Gap of the Mountain, this picture came from the collection of Johnson University, Johnson Bible College, and we just came out of nowhere one day and via email. This is the Gap of the Mountain, probably around 1917 or 18. This is what it used to look like, and like today with Chapman Highway going through it. That's the back end of a fuel truck that they, for some reason, included in the photo. But this was old Sevierville Pike, or Sevierville Pike, in those days before Chapman was even started. Very much more narrow than it appears today. And we continue talking about the name for just a moment, because there was a separate company but affiliated with the KS&E, the Pigeon River Railroad, not to be confused with the one that's over, actually goes into North Carolina, the railway over there. But the Pigeon River Railroad was a 10-mile segment that ran to Pigeon Forge from Sevierville. And it went on up just another mile or two to McCookville. Natty Branch would be the current place, you might know where it is. But it was an additional extension that was built up to Pigeon Forge and McCookville for the purpose of hauling timber, lumber out of there, and also tan bark. There was a huge depository at what is now Natty Branch Road of tan bark. And then this railroad went up, collected it, and brought it back out. This was in cooperation with the LeCompte Lumber Company. This is a map that was drawn by Mr. John Trotter. This is from the 1980s. This is as best as I could do as far as the scanning resolution. It was a newspaper article from the mid-80s. But Mr. Trotter drew from memory Pigeon Forge. So what you see here with the yellow highlighting is the railroad's route coming across from the Middle Creek area down and over, up and over the mountain next to the rear entrance to Dollywood and Splash Country and all that. Well, here it is coming into Pigeon Forge. There's two things we discovered from this. Number one, there were two depots in Pigeon Forge over the years, which he indicated on his drawing, old and current. And another thing that we discovered from this drawing is that there was a loop up at McCookville, or Natty Branch, where they turned the trains around and picked up the tan bark. So if you see the lower right corner there is a loop of track that he drew in, indicating how the trains were turned around. We have no other maps. The maps of the Pigeon River literally are impossible to locate. For some reason, they just never really had good mapping of the area. And the reason probably is because it was 1919 to 1929, and they just did not dedicate the resources to go up and map the area. This is a picture that you may have seen at Holston's, I believe is the restaurant here. And there's a lot of books that have this photo that says, this is the first train to Sevierville. Well, I can tell you that it's one of the first trains in terms of years, but this is most definitely not the first train to Sevierville, because we know where it came, and I'll talk about that in just a second. This picture, according to the one copy that we were able to locate, is actually hand dated June of 1912 in the lower right-hand corner. So this means that the train had been coming there for about 2.5 years. This is the station, however, that you see on the right, that was located roughly behind Ollie's discount store in Sevierville. This is the home of A.C. Andy Love farmhouse out on Old Knoxville Highway. Many of you may recognize it. It's right on the edge of the road. This, in the back yard of this residence, on this property owned by Mr. Love, was the temporary first station, the first train to Sevierville with all of its celebration, ranging from 200 to 600, depending on which newspaper you read. People welcomed this train with its VIPs on board, dignitaries. But it arrived at a small station that was in the back of this residence. So it was probably just a temporary shed that was constructed while the railroad was completed on up the river into West Sevierville. So this is the A.C. Love House. Very historic in terms of obviously history and farming, but also because of the railroad history that occurred there. January 1910 is when that first train arrived from Knoxville. Here's the station I mentioned earlier. This is the first permanent station that was located right behind where it is now Ollie's Discount. And Mr. Stafford and Mr. McAfee were employees of the station. Notice it had a freight shed behind and a passenger shed in front. This is the second permanent station in Sevierville. If you know where the, if you know where it is, the elementary school on Bruce Street, or which backs to Bruce Street today, this station sat on that property. And it was built when the Pigeon River line to McCookville and Pigeon Forge was being built. This was part of that project. The gentleman that you see in the front there is Roof Newman. He was the chief engineer, meaning design engineer, not train engineer. He designed the railroad to McCookville. And another thing that you all need to know, of any story I tell you, Mr. Newman was working in this building right next door to the boys' dormitory of Murphy College. The original Murphy College was right next door to this. He noticed flames coming out of the boys' dormitory, ran to the dormitory, vacated all the boys, every single one got out. He himself got sort of trapped in the third floor and had to leap for it and made it, but was slightly injured in the leap. So he's basically a hero to the county, the state, and to the nation for saving all those boys in 3 floors of dormitory. So that's Roof Newman. And he designed not only the station, but the railroad that it served. This would be also the station where the train carrying the boys going over there for World War I, the Great War, the train of Southern Railway cars came to this station and picked them up in downtown Sevierville. And there was an article in the paper saying, hey, everybody come, bring gifts, bring care packages, whatever you want to give the boys. The doughboys are going over. So this is where they left from. This was the final station in Sevierville. It was an abandoned warehouse that was located, if you look at Walgreens now, corner of 66 and West Main Street, right behind that, and until the early 70s, this building stood. And it was even documented in some of the articles that have been written about the railroad. The back side of it had a loading dock. You're going to see that here in a moment. But the actual business of the railroad was done inside the office of this old warehouse from about World War II, roughly 1940 until 1961. This is an example of a Type 3 depot. Now the thing about the railroads of the day, there was an American Association of Railroads, AAR, designed for certain buildings that railroads used. This would be known as a Type 3. It was a shed, more like a flag stop. So this is the one that was at Ewing, Tennessee, which is where that bridge photo was made earlier with the green locomotive.
Where at that intersection was this depot?
It would have been, as you pass through the intersection going towards Boyd's Creek Highway, make a left on Reed Schoolhouse, and it would have been right there in that sort of V of property, which is just after you make the left turn onto Reed Schoolhouse.
Where the little bit of the golf course is.
Absolutely, yeah. You have to trespass to see some of the features of the railroad right there. And I can tell you with great authority that it's getting harder by the year. Stuff's growing so much.
Yeah.
Now, I know that you all are the Smoky Mountain Historical Association, but I'm going to show you the Knoxville end. This is where the station was in Knoxville. This may even look familiar to you since Ayers Hall, which in this photo was almost brand new, about 1925-26. This is looking down from the Knoxville and Augusta branch of the Southern, the High Line, that still goes across Cumberland Avenue on the overpass. This is looking towards the brick building on the left is the original depot in Knoxville, which served 2 other railroads, maybe 3. So it was used, that's the L-shaped brick building. And then the yard, per se, is a small 4-track yard, was just across Main Street, Main Avenue. So this is in the V that used to be Cumberland and Main, next to UT. This was changed dramatically over the years, especially when they made that V a smaller intersection. But this would have been the station that you leave from to ride a train from Knoxville to Sevierville. And it operated up until about 1938. Now we're back to Sevierville, and this is another picture you might have seen in the courthouse or in or City Hall, rather. This is the bridge being built in about 1916 and 17, which crossed the Little Pigeon in downtown. And if you notice, the upper left corner is the building we're sitting in. This is looking down Bruce Street. This is how the bridge lined up from coming from the station over here on the Walgreens side of the river, which of course the river was rechanneled in 66-ish. So the railroad was routed straight down Bruce Street, heading off towards Pigeon Forge, Middle Creek, Pigeon Forge, McCookwood. And this was the bridge that was built. It was rather a very elaborate bridge, as you can see. I think seven piers and very good trestle work at the end. This is when it was nearing completion. About 1916, early 17. This is an interesting picture showing the railroad proceeding down what is today Bruce Street, and that is Murphy College, the original Murphy College, which I understand today is that not the Sevier County Board of Education building. So that building still stands, and there you can see a gentleman with his straw hat on crossing Bruce Street in the trackage. Here's another picture that we think is somewhere in East Sevierville, but we have nothing. The church steeple on the left doesn't relate to any photos we've seen, so we're not 100% certain this is Bruce Street, but it's really the only place we know of where the railroad dissected the street as it does here. And also, interestingly, come to us to the fair. I wish we got the full picture of that Model T with that sign on the back of it there. And that is a train, by the way, believed to be the Pigeon River Railroad headed to McCookville and Pigeon Forge. Here's a picture which is from TVA, aerial flooding in I think it was 64, 65, when the entire city was underwater. And if you notice at the lower left, the rather elaborate engine house of the Smoky Mountain Railroad is at the lower left. See the water tank, and another landmark there just to the left of the water tank are the fuel tanks of the Fisher Texaco distributorship. They were neighbors and supporters and shippers on the Smoky Mountain Railroad. So this, of course, shows that the river was pretty much too close for comfort to downtown at the time I was born, which is 1965. And then you can see the railroad proceeding. It curves to the left. It crosses the river there in a straight section, and you see, of course, the courthouse and the rest of Bruce Street. So that's how it lined up to go down Bruce. That's some young guy in Sevierville standing in the approximate location of the yard. This would be behind Crystal and to the right of Walgreens. So if you see where the historical marker stands today on West Main Street, it says Knoxville, Sevierville, and Eastern. It's right next to the Walgreens on West Main. It's referring to this site, which was the turntable, the staging tracks, the engine house, water tank, and the freight depot. This picture was from 1994, I believe. Here's a photo of the facilities taken from the coal ramp, looking back at the engine house. Once again, the tanks of Fisher Texaco. Fisher Texaco's office building still stands. It's the little frame house right behind Walgreens, which for a while there was a barbecue place recently. Here's the turntable. It was installed about 1916. Before that, the engines actually had to reverse themselves back to almost to Vestal in Knoxville, and then turn around on a Y in Vestal. And that is the old 441 bridge there. So you're basically looking towards 66 with the bridge in the background for West Main Street, where the river used to go under.
Was that turntable hand turned, or did you have?
It was a very timely question, since Conductor Linebarger is at right, pushing it, and Fireman Calvin Pryor is at left. You can see his head sticking up, and the engineer, whomever it was balancing it to the point where they could turn it by hand. And therefore, it was known as an Armstrong turntable. That's a 73-ton locomotive. Speaking of the gap of the mountain and the engine abandoned, here it is. Here's number 110. The people that owned the Esso station were burning garbage in its firebox. All the appliances were stolen, the bell, the light. Actually, I think they kept the bell. I think the light was stolen. And but we, actually, believe it or not, have recovered all that stuff. So this was sitting right off of Chapman. Many of you, I'm sure, may remember seeing it. I've had people say I used to play on that engine. But we also heard that there were hornets' nests and everything else in it. It was purchased in 1972 and moved to the north, and it still operates today. It's a blurry photo, but I included it for one reason. It shows a diesel pump at the corner of the building. You can barely see it here, but it's a Texaco diesel green pump, and that is what they used to fuel the diesel engine once it started service in 1955. And naturally, Fisher Texaco provided the service as they were next door neighbors. And this is looking from the turntable back towards Co-op. That concrete oval-shaped building is still standing as a landmark. You can see it today. Engine house on the left and water tank. An old
Where is the oval to that?
straight back. Look on the track, go straight, and you see a rounded concrete built structure at the end of the track there. And it's at Co-op. It's next to the current Co-op.
It's on the Co-op property.
Yes, it was originally part of it. Here's they only had a couple of items of passenger rolling stock. And this is 100, this is car number 100. And I like this picture because there's a dog on the porch enjoying the sun. Here's our little friend, the diesel, at the point, and this was about 1957, 58. That is the back of the station I was telling you about, the abandoned warehouse. This is where they did their freight business. Very likely that blue truck was Temple's Mill truck. The family was married to the people operating the railroad were part of the Temple family, so they borrowed the truck. And speaking of which, this is H.A. Cutshaw, who was the superintendent of the Smoky Mountain Railroad. He was a naval veteran of World War II, won the Bronze Star, and he was married to Mrs. Frankie Temple Cutshaw. And that's a neat picture because you can see the steeple of the courthouse in the window behind him. So he's in his office there as superintendent. He was tragically killed in the mid-60s in a car wreck. But a very, very leading citizen. He was in it. Every club you could think of, he was in it. Here's Conductor Linebarger riding across the trestle at Boyd's Creek, which was probably, arguably, the most famous structure on the Smoky Mountain line. Later, it was so rickety and decrepit that the crew would actually dismount and walk across. Then the engineer would send the engine across, and he would walk across after the engine, making sure that the trestle wasn't going to collapse under the weight of the 140,000-pound locomotive and train. Here's the train coming into Sevierville. This would be behind the Sevier Plaza with the Ollies and the former Tractor Supply. So it's basically running along the existing riverbed there. Here it is crossing West Main Street. Believe it or not, that's 441 it's crossing. We know this because in the original picture, far left, there's street signs saying 441 and Tennessee Highway 71. Same view, and here again is that oval-shaped concrete building, which was co-op. And Smoky Mountain Stage Trailways bus awaiting crossing. He's headed to Gatlinburg. Here, right next door to us here on Bruce Street, this is Conductor Linebarger escorting number 206 engine down Bruce Street. And I'm told that the cars had to dive into the parking places to get out of the way when this train was coming down the street. The prime shipper on the railroad over the years was the King Lumber Company. Flooring coming out and I guess lumber going in, I'm assuming. Another view from the coal ramp at the station. This is engine 107. You may know it today as the one that sits on the Parkway in Pigeon Forge behind the Dollywood ticket office. It says Dollywood Express on it now. It's a static display, but it still exists. And oh, by the way, number 206 still exists down at Chattanooga at the Chattanooga Choo Choo Hotel. They just dressed it up like a old Western engine, but it's still the same engine. And here, of course, is the diesel, number 440, with a Southern boxcar, presumably, since it's close to the A.J. King Lumber Company operation, we presume it's coming back towards the station, toward Knoxville, and the Southern boxcar probably has flooring in it. This is a very poor print, but it's a news photograph from the Chicago Tribune showing the city fathers of Sevierville covering up the tracks of the railroad with asphalt and tar because they argued that the railroad didn't take care of the tracks well enough, and so they covered the tracks. Well, here comes the steam engine to break that back up again because they had their train to run. It took them 3 hours to go up and down Bruce Street. And the irony here, the comedy actually, although it's an appreciated thing that's been done, is we now have a simulated track running down the middle of the same street built by the city, whereas in 1950 the city covered the tracks up saying you can't have your railroad anymore. So we're celebrating what used to be not celebrated. Here's the crew breaking up the tar. This was in the Chicago Tribune. One last note about Bruce Street. In 1951, the Kappa Alpha fraternity from UT, which was known to wear rebel uniforms, Confederate uniforms everywhere they went, to every event, ball games and everything, they arranged to have an outing on the Smoky Mountain where they rode the train to Sevierville from UT and got the key to the city after, quote, invading and not firing a shot the Sevierville city. So the mayor of Sevierville gave them the key to the city. And this was them riding down Bruce Street on a flat car with the Sevier County High School band. That was a Confederate flag, by the way. I blacked it out for obvious reasons. I had to give this at the school, and there's no way they would have appreciated it. And here's the three guys that were the instrumental planners of that event. This is down at Knoxville. Yes, that was a Confederate battle flag in the one guy's hand. Blacked out. This is an interesting slide here. We're getting close to the end. This is the photograph of the little diesel pulling its pulpwood train. Anybody want to guess where that is?
The old steakhouse.
That's it.
Yeah, that's right.
Anybody that's been to my presentation before would know that. But yes, very good. Yeah, this is in the cut of Brown Mountain, known as King's Gap. King's Gap. So there was a massive cut of railroad grading and cut into that gap there, and that's how he passed through it. It's a beautiful cut. If you ever get a chance to hike down in there, just be careful and do it when it's not wet, because it gets really boggy down there. And one last couple of notes here for the presentation, please. This is in 1961 or 62. This is the engine Klondike Kate, which now runs at Dollywood. And the nearest facility, when they brought it down from Alaska to run on the Rebel Railroad, the nearest facility was in Sevierville, the engine house abandoned from the Smoky Mountain. So they brought it here and did work on it to get it ready to operate on the Rebel Railroad, which was the original attraction. Here it is, Klondike Kate. And a proof of that is right outside. It came from the White Pass and Yukon Railway, and there's its tender sitting next to another gas pump that was used for the diesel in Sevierville. So this is also in Sevierville. And there's the Rebel Railroad in its original. These are two of the engines, the 107 on the right from the Smoky Mountain and the 206. They were eventually split up, and like I said, one was sent to Chattanooga for use as a display. The 107 remains in Pigeon Forge. But they were basically a big billboard in about 62 or 63. And finally, the last dreaded day, this is when the same scrap metal company that owned the railroad for 19 years got the contract to pull the rails up. Their original purpose in buying the railroad was to scrap the railroad. Well, they came along and realized that Douglas Dam was going to be built, and oh, by the way, what was the closest railroad to Douglas Dam? The Smoky Mountain. So they abandoned the abandonment, and then later, in 1966, came along and actually pulled up all the iron and scrapped it and sold it. This is at the Gap of the Mountain. And this was them abandoning engine 110 where it sat for those 8 years. I apologize for going a little longer, but does anyone have any questions?
That was fascinating.
So a question regarding the TVA construction. So
Yes.
they built a spur line out to Douglas Dam,
Yeah.
and that operated during the construction period. And then that
Right, at exactly the place that was, we were talking about the Ewing Shed Depot, the little shed, and Old Knoxville Highway at Reed Schoolhouse, there was a turnout, a switch. That went to the construction site 5 miles, nearly to Kodak. There was a rather elaborate bridge that went over to the construction site on the other side of the river. That was done. They had an engine that worked the other side of the river. It would come and pick up the cars across the bridge and then tow them back over to the construction site. So yes, there was, during 1942 and 43 were the years that the Smoky Mountain was used and abused. That's another thing that I need to mention is at the time of the dam construction, DAM, the dam construction, 3 engines at a time with approximately 1 million pounds of freight, heavy steel and heavy materials for the dam, were taken over this little railroad. And that went on for 2 solid years. You can imagine what a 1 million pound train would do to the Boyd's Creek Trestle. This is a railroad that was built with 50-pound rail, 56 to 60 pounds, little bitty rail, and very, very brittle cross ties. So part of the reason that the Smoky Mountain was abandoned in 61 was just it was in deplorable condition. The railroad had $273 in the bank. They could not have repaired it. Had a young millionaire come along. Can you imagine what a tourist attraction it would have been to get on a train if they'd restored that railroad and ride from Knoxville to Pigeon Forge or even Sevierville? So it was an idea before its time. Yes, sir.
Do you have any photos of the spur to the dam side?
I do have a photo. I don't have it here. I do have a photo, and I'll get one put up somewhere where you can see it. It shows that the bridge that they built across the river to the dam construction site.
Across the French Broad River?
Yes.
Okay.
It was a massive thing. And it was a railroad bridge and a road. Vehicles drove across it when trains weren't using it. And that comes from the Library of Congress book about the construction.
Is that the bridge that was bought from the city of Dandridge and moved there?
That I don't know. But I do know it was a tremendous trestle work, curved. It was a curved bridge. And went over to the construction side. And of course they had a cement plant, and I think there was a quarry over there. But TVA dedicated one engine for that side of the river, and it would come and pick up whatever the Smoky Mountain brought. They would not allow the Smoky train to go onto the bridge. Probably just the equipment reliability questions. But yeah, I've got a photo of that though. And there's actually, it's guarded. It was wartime, and there was a guy standing there in a jungle helmet, in uniform with his M1 or whatever, Springfield, whatever he had, and he's standing there guarding the bridge. And if it had not been for the Smoky Mountain Railroad, then Douglas Dam would not occur.
All the excitement when it was first coming to Sevierville, people greeting it and all that, was the excitement because of its novelty, because it would serve as transportation and touristy kinds of things, or for industrial purposes, or
All of it.
all of the above?
But not so much touristy. But you may remember in reading, if any of you have seen the book Last Train to Elkmont about the Little River, or Whistle Across the Mountain, Sunday school classes would go and get on a train and ride somewhere. So there was recreational benefits of having this little railroad. And they operated really nice equipment originally. It was not until Chapman Highway came along and that the scrap metal dealers from West Virginia in 1938 bought the railroad for the purpose of scrapping it. But then they realized, wait a minute, we can make a windfall from TVA off this dam. So that no more abandonment. It wasn't until then that decline really occurred. Once trucks and buses could run on Chapman, the novelty wore off.
So 2 questions in regard to that. One
Yes.
was that when the train came to Sevierville, that was primary transportation, because I don't believe Sevierville had a bus line at that point in time. So
They had hacks.
They had hacks.
Yes.
Right, and other than that, and there were very few automobiles, and really the roads weren't worth
The
driving.
roads were pathetic.
My mother, who's 94, tells stories about riding the railroad to Knoxville, go to the theater and stuff like that. So
Right.
in the 30s, that was the primary, that was a big opening of transportation. It opened up Sevierville and Sevier County to Knoxville and the big city.
Exactly.
When that happened. And wasn't the last owner of the railroad a group of Sevierville businessmen?
Yes.
And is that why the train was, or the engine was abandoned in the gap, because the rails were pulled up and they didn't have any way to get it out?
Well, they did abandon it, as the photo shows. They did remove the rails, but the main reason they tried to tow that engine to Knoxville they were going to send the 110 to an amusement park in Massachusetts. And as a matter of interest, a trade magazine, a railroad magazine of the day, which I have a copy of, it said it had been sold to the Pleasure Island Amusement Park in Massachusetts. Well, the bridges were not sturdy enough to carry 73 tons of number 110 and number 440 diesel, so they had to stop. They could not get it. They were having troubles with derailments and bridge being unsure, so they brought it back to Seymour, to Schutzgap, and left it. And it was actually sold, but then I guess they refunded the money. Of course, the thing about this railroad was it stayed in almost a continuous state of bankruptcy because of mismanagement and or greed and or lack of deferred maintenance, whatever. It was never at a point where it was making great money, except 1942-43 when they built the dam, and they were making huge amounts of money. And you should see the salaries that the junk dealers were paying themselves based on the windfall coming from TVA. But that engine was intended to go to Massachusetts and ended up in Indiana. And the only way that they were able to get it there was to bring a Mettler crane and a lowboy and haul it down the road. And that's the way they did it. And took it to Knoxville, where they put it on the Southern Railway.
What was the rationale for asphalting the railroad in Sevierville?
They didn't want the railroad to operate because the agreement was between the city and the railroad originally, and the county also, was that the railroad would make sure that the ties that were within the street asphalt, they would not sink or cause people damage to their springs and their, there were cars that were getting jammed in the railroad trackage because it was sinking into the ground. So the city fathers said, you're a nuisance and you're dangerous and we're shutting you down. And they paved over it. And it made the national news. As did, by the way, the rebel invasion. That story also came from a Chicago news story. Yes, ma'am.
Would you tell the story about the child that was killed at Dishman's Curve?
Dishman's Curve, right. In the early 1920s, there was a family that lived very close to Gloria Day Lutheran Church in the Curve there in South Knoxville. What we used to know as Cam and Engine Repair was a shop that was right next to it. This family had, I believe, 11 children, 10 or 11. And they were just, they were basically, I guess, almost like sharecroppers. They were renting, or they were living on this farm there. Of course, now this is way before Chapman existed. It was open farm. And the little girl, they were outside. I think about 8 of the children were out in the property. And a little girl ran across the railroad track. Well, you may realize that not only does the highway curve there, but the railroad curves severely. So she crossed the railroad track. Along comes a Knoxville-bound steam engine and train at what was a full clip, which probably was been 11, 12 miles an hour, but still considerable for a heavy train to be rolling that fast. And the train ran over her, basically cut her in two. And so we didn't know about this until somehow I had gotten a picture of a gravestone that was at Valley Grove Baptist, which was my church as a youth. I went there until I was 18. Never heard of this story. But the family placed a gravestone, a memorial marker there for the little girl. And it said, killed by the old Smoky Railway next to Chapman Highway. Well, Chapman Highway didn't exist when it happened, but that gives people a relative point of where it happened. But yes, Dishman's Curve was very close, about 100 feet from the very main part of that curve on the highway there is where this occurred. One of the chapters in my book is called Accidents and Tragedies. And it was almost like the railroad was a killing machine for a while. Not only did the little girl pass on, but there was 5 or 6 other fatals that occurred and different incidents, mostly related to a gasoline-powered motor coach that they bought to make passenger travel a little more pleasant. Instead of riding behind a cinder belching engine, they got a gasoline powered rail car. Well, this rail car killed like 4 or 5 people. And ultimately, the railroad sold it to the Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia Railway in Chattanooga. So that thing, as you'll see here shortly, when we get the books on the street, the railroad had a lot of accidents and a lot of incidents. And these are things that we've just recently found in the last few years. But that was the most tragic, I think, easily. Ida Cogdill was her name. I was trying to think of her name. Ida Cogdill. And she was one of 11 children.
Joe, the locomotives that made their way to Rebel Railroad,
Yeah.
were they driven up the McCookville line, or were
No,
they
they took
locomotive
one
type
local
thing?
line. The McCookville line disappeared in 1929. You had the stock market crash and, coincidentally, a gigantic flood in 1929. And as you know, the railroad was along Middle Creek. The railroad was along the Little Pigeon branch through Pigeon Forge, and it just got completely flooded. It washed out on what a segment of a quarter mile long. And then in October of 29, Wall Street. So they cut it off. But the remainder of the railroad that was not abandoned was the section down Bruce Street to A.J. King Lumber Company and just beyond. That was 1.5 miles. The original Pigeon River line, 1.5 miles survived till '61, serving the A.J. King Lumber Company. But they had to lowboy both of those, and then turned around and took 206 to Chattanooga. So that was even more.
And one more question. Did,
Yeah.
did the 110 run from Knoxville to Sevierville? Was that the only route that it did? Were all the locomotives, were they just in one section?
Well, in terms of when it was a Smoky Mountain engine,
It just ran
correct. It would have been from 1940. What happened was Little River closed down. The lumber company shut down in 38 or 39. So they sold the 110, which was, like I said, a custom-built, very, very historic and very significantly important engine in terms of technically. They sold it to the Smoky Mountain. So what happened was they ran it through Maryville, from Wallen to Maryville, Maryville to Knoxville, to the Coster shop, and reconfigured it, rebuilt it basically, or upgraded it, and then ran it up to Sevierville to be locomotive here on the Smoky Mountain. So it actually served on both operations. Yeah. Any other questions? I know I've worn you all out.
Tell us about your book.
Yes.
The book is called The Slow and Easy, and as I should have mentioned earlier, I think I have a graphic. The book is called Slow and Easy, Shrine of Shortline Railroading, Volume 1. It is complete. We've had a couple of aborted launches, and the reason being is quality issues. I'm self-publishing. I did not want to put something out that was going to fall apart in your hands as you know, the binding. So right now, near Dallas, there's a publisher that we're using, and it will be anytime. I'm expecting the box of them to show up at my house. But we're basically self-publishing it. We hope to get it on Amazon, like others. We definitely want to place it in libraries and hobby shops here in Knoxville, and in any other like historical center. It's $29.99 is going to be the cost of it. It's a soft cover, black and white. We had to go with black and white just due to the cost. The slides are beautiful, but man, it's expensive, you know, to get them done in color with color plates. So it will be about 285 pages. And Volume 1 is a collection of various stories that we've collected over the years from folks that have come like yourselves to these presentations. And so that's about a third of it. The second third is talking about the railroad itself. And then the third portion is a gallery. And we've been very blessed to receive a lot of photos from folks who generously have given their photos and said, hey, get them out there, get them published, because the ultimate goal is to educate everyone as to this railroad that they may not have even known came into their own town. But we do have a huge amount of interest. It has been a long time coming, but it is finished, and we're trying to get distribution set up. So I figure if I can get the initial batch in that's of good quality, then we're going to try to get those out for a holiday, for those that we can get them to. But it will be the first of about 3 volumes, because now that we have the format, we've got enough material easily for 3 volumes of history on this railroad.
How will you notify?
I'm going to hand out a flyer here with email address, website, and as soon as they're ready, I'm going to post, because I do our own website too, we're going to post on there how to get a hold of me, how to get a hold of a copy, and also the information about it. It'll be on the flyer. And also, as I hand those out, if you don't already have one, or even if you do, I brought about 20 or 25 copies of an article that I wrote just a couple of years ago, and it gives you more background on the railroad, especially from the Knox County perspective, because it's for the Knox County Focus newspaper. So I brought copies of those. If you're interested in getting one, just feel free, help yourself, but I'm going to give you the flyers as well. Yes, sir.
If you take the Parkway to Boyd's Creek
Yes.
and turn to the left like you're going to Seymour, about 5 miles down you'll cross the creek and there's a big curve and there's a subdivision there called Dogwood Hills. And when you turn in on Corey into Dogwood Hills, there's a big mound that the street goes through, and we were told that was the old railroad bed.
Very likely it was.
That's good.
That describes exactly the route. Essentially, it ran parallel to what is today Boyd's Creek Highway.
Yeah, this would be
Here and there departing crossing. There were 3 crossings, one of which mentioned that motor bus, the rail car. These poor fellows, these five guys were in a Model T Ford crossing at the 20-mile crossing, which is near McMahon, I'm not sure how to say that up here. I've always heard 2 different ways. But the community, McMahon, here was a crossing, and these guys crossed just as that motor coach was probably zipping along around 20, 25 miles an hour, and killed 3 of them. The other 2 survived. All 5 of these guys lived in Knoxville, and they were going to the mountains that day. And they all worked together at the Sturkey Furniture Factory. They lived in the same neighborhood. They all worked. They just got together on a Sunday, and boy, did they hit the wrong place at the wrong time. That was that motor coach. And you'll see that story in the book also.
Did you say you had a book called Accidents and Tragedies?
That's one of the chapters.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it features, I try to be positive and negative. We show all the negative and then we talk about the positive and funny. There's a lot of humor in this railroad, you'll see. But it's just been a lifelong quest to get information about it. Anybody else?
How did you get interested? I'm curious, what is the particular thing that has attracted you to this subject that keeps you?
Dad, on Sunday drives, we lived in South Knoxville, and in those days, the interstate exit 407 didn't exist. When I was a young boy, we'd go Chapman, and he would swing off on Old Sevierville Pike there at the gap of the mountain. And when we were going to the mountains, we would literally follow the path of the old Slow and Easy. And he would point out the crossings. Hey, look at that, you can see the Slow and Easy. Oh, he called it the Old Smoky. Dad didn't say Slow and Easy, he said Old Smoky. But anyway, to make a long story short, a book came out which we found a copy of at Green Acres Flea Market on the Alcoa Highway. And this book was called Ghost Railroads of Tennessee. Chapter 1 was about the Smoky Mountain Railroad. So here, after all these years of being told about it, we find this book, open up chapter 1, and there's photos. That was the very first exposure. And I've told this story 100 times, but Dad said, "How much you want for the book?" And this little guy says, $10 or 2 for 15. Dad bought one. He's a school teacher. He didn't have any money. You know. Well, as it turns out, when I was overseas in the 80s and 90s, the book Ghost Railroads, first edition, was selling at Abe's Books in New York City for $700 a copy because it was such a limited run. It wasn't until the mid-90s that they released the second run, which was inferior. It was a copies. You know, these imprint books, you open them up and they're lesser graphic quality. The first one had glossy pages and it's a really beautiful book. I wish you'd bought that second one. I'd have had one. So I had to live for like 20 years with just photocopies. But yeah, it was high demand. And even today, on eBay, they're over $100 a copy. I walked into McKay's about 2 years ago down in West Knoxville and I found one for $3. 2 weeks later, I walked in McKay's and found another one for $3. And then I found one for $35.
So one.
The objective was all 4 of my children to have a copy, and now they do. But it's a beautiful book. I want to thank you all for being so patient and being such good listeners. I hope worn out my welcome, but thank you. And I'm going to hand out some information to you. If anybody has any questions, I'll stick around until I can be told to leave. So thank you all.
Well, Joe, thank you for bringing to us today a real example of how quickly an important historical part of a community can just disappear. And in less than a lifetime, there's almost no sign of this railroad today.
And a lot of people that are gone now.
Well, thank you a lot for this, and I want to make just an announcement or two, and then we'll be finished. Our next meeting is January the 16th, 2022, and the program will be presented by Joe Emmert. Joe lives in Maryville, Tennessee, and he's going to bring us some information about a research report that's being done on veterans buried in the national park. And so I assure you it's going to be a good program. And so now as we end, I'd like you to please join us for refreshments over to the right.